Iran has been subject to verification since the JCPOA signing in 2015, and constant checks by the UNs Nuclear Watchdog, the IAEA, have verified 15 times that Iran has been in compliance with that deal. But the tables have turned. Iran got barely anything more than promises for its compliance. Now it will return to full commitment only if the US lifts sanctions off this country in one sweeping move. It has agreed to nothing else. It may mean leaving with nothing for both sides, but Iran is adamant it's not going to get bitten again. It insists this time this country will be doing the verifying. It will verify sanctions have been lifted, and only then will it start reversing back into its nuclear commitments to the deal. So far, Iranian strategy has at least gotten the US seriously thinking, even perhaps contemplating taking the first step to revive the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. I'm Leila Faramarzi, and you're watching Iran Today. Iran's adamance in performing checks and balances before recommitting stems from a profound distrust for the US. The US earned this distrust on several occasions, even before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when Iran and America were still fast friends. Mr. Abolfat is a political analyst, one of the best at national TV, so you can imagine his all-round detailed vision of matters in his domain. Let's hear his take at Press TV Studios. Would things have been any different if the Shah were in place, the friend of America? Because even then, they wouldn't have allowed us nuclear technology.
نشانه‌های خیلی زیادی وجود داره، حداقل در حوزه هسته‌ای.
There have been many indicators that the Americans were taking measures to prevent Iran from acquiring peaceful nuclear technology. Americans themselves did not engage with Iran, but the Germans signed a contract to build the Bushehr power plant. They did their utmost to ensure that Iran wouldn't advance past a certain point. Evidence suggests if it wasn't for the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Americans wouldn't let Iran acquire peaceful nuclear technology.
Mr. Izadi is professor of international studies. He often comes up with the unexpected, but with logical reason attached. It was worth the trek out into center-west Tehran. What lessons would you say Iran's JCPOA experience with the US has borne for the world?
The point that Biden and people like Antony Blinken were making before they got into office about Trump leaving the agreement is actually true. That if countries realize that you make an agreement with one administration, and once that administration leaves, the agreement is nullified by the next administration, no one is going to be able to make any agreements with the United States. So US says that it's an important country, but when it comes to international agreements, it acts like a banana republic.
Even before the Trump administration's reimposition of secondary sanctions in May 2018, after they unilaterally pulled out of the nuclear deal, Iran was not receiving the full benefits of sanctions relief. The main impediment was that major banks were reluctant to facilitate transactions or provide financing for Iran-linked projects. So most major deals signed with a vision of the JCPOA working hit a roadblock. Iran had placed orders for Boeing and Airbus aircraft, had attempted joint ventures with automakers Peugeot and Renault and Daimler. It had struck energy deals with Total and CNPC and rail projects with Siemens and Alstom. But even before Trump, a shady Republican, was elected to office, they lost faith in the nuclear deal and Iran's economic stability. As expected, they thought it too risky to venture into Iranian waters. Mr. Ajorlu is editor-in-chief of Mosallas magazine. He generously welcomed us to review and weigh the JCPOA's chances with us.
ببینید در این 4 سال گذشته، در این 5 سال گذشته اروپا
You see, in the past 4 or 5 years, Europe has talked about Instex and the revival of the JCPOA. Mr. Rouhani downplayed the importance of the matter, saying that the P5+1 has turned to P4+1. But we don't look at the issue optimistically. In the past 2 or 3 years, we have witnessed the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani and Mr. Fakhrizadeh. There has also been the recent incident at Natanz. We can't take these lightly just because we are negotiating with Europe. Europe is basically powerless.
Former US President Trump renewed Iran's distrust in 2018, not just by pulling out of the deal and comically reimposing UN sanctions. As Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif put it, the US had imposed, reimposed, or relabeled some 1,600 sanctions on Iran, inflicting $1 trillion worth of direct and indirect economic damage on this country. In fact, Trump's scorched earth sanctions policy has done everything to make it impossible for President Biden to return to the JCPOA. At least, that's what it aimed for.
We don't know if Biden wants to, because Biden generally belongs to the right wing of the Democratic Party. He's very close to the Israelis, and whether he wants to go back to JCPOA is very much in doubt.
If there's any chance the JCPOA can be brought up to speed with what was intended, Iran will make sure that actually happens. Sanction lifting has to happen in action and practice and not just on paper. And sanction lifting verification will take time. Parliament estimates 3 to 6 months. And it insists verification has to be continual, for example, once every 6 months, in order to make sure Iran's economic interests, financial interests are being secured. Barack Obama, America's signing president himself, said the deal was not built on trust but verification of compliance. So Iran was under constant surveillance by the IAEA. Now, Iran expects to do the surveillance. One option might be to establish a new panel of experts or special rapporteur at the United Nations responsible for gathering, interpreting and assessing evidence on the implementation of sanctions relief. There's always talk of the IAEA confirming Iran's conformity with the JCPOA. Can we create no council, international council, to keep an eye on other parties to the deal?
متاسفانه واقعیت تلخ نظام بین‌الملل یک
Unfortunately, this is the bitter reality of the international system. We aren't dealing with a just system. The great powers abuse their authority and follow international law wherever it's politically expedient, and disregard it when it's not to their benefit. There is a lack of a higher authority to prosecute those countries. Of course, there is an international court of justice and criminal court, but Americans often do not comply with their rulings.
Time for a short break. We'll be back in no time. What would verification mean? It means Iran must be able to sign contracts, export oil, and bring in the revenues via banking channels or find other uses for them. Let's not forget the JCPOA was intended to boost Iran's economy and foreign trade relations in return for this country limiting its nuclear program, which it has maintained is for peaceful purposes.
I think we certainly can regain our power by taking an appropriate approach and analysis of the regional issues. But today, the Iranian people are feeling psychological and economic insecurities. This is the result of believing that dealing with the US will solve all the problems. They tried it out and realized that it wasn't possible. Didn't Mr. Biden say he would return to the JCPOA once he takes office? Why hasn't he returned? Why is he saying he won't resume full compliance until Iran does? We have the experience of drawing up a legal contract and signing and verifying it. But after all that, they might tear the agreement apart someday. There is no guarantee in place whatsoever.
Why the United Nations to establish such a verification mechanism? Some reasons are, first, the nuclear deal is enshrined in United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. That obligates promoting and facilitating the development of normal economic and trade contacts and cooperation with Iran. Second, the IAEA, a United Nations agency, is already involved in verifying half of the nuclear deal's quid pro quo. Third, Iran has itself turned to United Nations bodies to say file a suit at the International Court of Justice against the US for not holding its end of the bargain with the JCPOA. Fourth, the issue of sanctions relief impacts Iran's relationships with the wider international community. I'm talking non-JCPOA countries that wouldn't want to raise their concerns at a forum dominated by the US. Non-partial countries that share economic interests with Iran and cannot afford the blow of secondary US sanctions imposed on dealing with Iran are countries such as Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, and North Korea.
اتفاقا با جامعه باید اینجوری سخن بگیم که ما گره زده.
As a matter of fact, this is how we should speak to the people. We must explain that our attempts at establishing ties with the West have hurt us. We have shown goodwill to the West, Europe, US, Russia and China. But the upshot was more sanctions on the oil and banking sectors, yet we remain committed to the agreement. More importantly, there have been a few terror attacks, both against our high-ranking officials and our nuclear sites. In my opinion, we need to send the messages through political, military and security means. We can't stop at the political level. We can define new relations on an international level.
The insurance and shipment of Iranian oil tankers, as well as the global money transfer SWIFT mechanism, are among Iran's top priorities in securing oil sales and incoming petrodollars. It is being discussed what should be done regarding Iran's technical commitments and how they be carried out in case a party falls short on their promise. This Kazem Gharibabadi said of the early April nuclear talks in Vienna. Gharibabadi is Iran's ambassador to the UNs Nuclear Watchdog and a delegation member to the said Vienna talks, at which Iran explored options to prevent a potential repeat of what happened in 2018. That is when Donald Trump binned the nuclear deal and yet expected to have a say in its implementation.
When they say you come and talk to us, what they actually mean is that you come and give us more concessions, give us more stuff. And Iran is not interested in doing that because the concessions that Iran gave last time resulted in almost nothing for Iran. So why would you want to sit down with the same people that you gave them concessions before and they didn't do much?
Plenty more to be said, but first a quick look at other media outlets to see what others have to say on our affairs. And here's what they actually say in words. Mer News makes a mention of Iran's eastern partners to the JCPOA who want to help bring the deal up to scratch. Moscow doing its utmost to find solution to JCPOA revival. The Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said he accepts the US State Department's assessment of the process, which it described as difficult. Firstly, because there is no trust between Tehran and Washington, and obviously there can be no such trust. That is why it is very difficult to reach any agreement. Second, actions need to be verified, which is a very sensitive and complex issue. Even without this, the process is very difficult because there is so much deviation from the initial characteristics of the JCPOA that returning to the original state requires great political will, the Russian official said. We've got Reuters that quotes the French foreign minister on how tactical problems and Iranian politics are hindering revival of nuclear talks. France's foreign minister said the efforts to revive nuclear talks with Iran were being held up by tactical problems and the domestic situation in Iran ahead of its presidential election in June. There's a tactical problem and also an internal issue in Iran, which is in a particular situation because we are quite close to the presidential election in June. This Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian told a hearing at the French Senate. He did not say what the tactical problem was, but added that while there was a stated will to return to talks, tensions remained, and it was urgent to move forward to calm the situation. Iran's Tasnim News says how time matters. Dragging feet on Iran sanctions removal, ruining chances of JCPOA revival, said the spokesman for the Iranian administration. He warned the violators of the 2015 nuclear deal that procrastination in lifting the sanctions against Tehran would ruin the opportunity for the revival of the accord. Speaking at a press conference, Ali Rabi advised the violators of the JCPOA to seize the opportunity to salvage the nuclear deal by terminating sanctions on Iran. They should know that every day of further delay in lifting the sanctions against Iran will only dim the chances of revival of the JCPOA as the first and last solution available for putting aside the differences, but also push them away from a better prospect for relations with Iran, he warned. The spokesperson also made it clear that the only logical option for the US administration is to rejoin the JCPOA and fully end the sanctions on Iran. And that would be it for this section. Do stay tuned. As the Vienna nuclear talks proceeded, Iran did say it was in no hurry for results. Results are what it is looking for, but if the US must lose time, Iran will carry on with enriching uranium to levels higher than that stipulated in the nuclear deal. That's to say, it is producing and storing enriched uranium with a 20% purity level, breaking the 3.67% enrichment parameter set by the deal. Iran might even go up to 60% purification if the country needs it. Would you say Israel might achieve its goal? Can it put a spanner in the works with Iran's talks with JCPOA partners?
Obviously, this type of terrorist acts is not going to stop Iran's nuclear program. As you saw, Dr. Salehi, the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency, said that they are building facilities inside the mountains near Natanz, near the current nuclear site. Israel is actually making Iran's nuclear program stronger.
Sunday, 11th April, the electrical grid of the Natanz nuclear site was disrupted. This coincided with the anniversary of the National Day of Nuclear Technology in Iran, and during this country's efforts to push the West into lifting sanctions. Bit of a coincidence, given disruption at Natanz has been one of the methods of sabotage in this strategic facility for many years. Only last July, a mysterious explosion shook the plant. Also on Tuesday, as Vienna talks began to revive US participation in the JCPOA, an Iranian vessel stationed in the Red Sea was damaged by an apparent Israeli mine attack. With such bad will in Iran's backyard, the US will have to try that much harder to rekindle the deal.
You know, the Israelis have been saying this for some time, that in order to slow down Iran's nuclear program, or in order to stop Iran's peaceful nuclear program, you don't have to give Iran concessions. You don't have to negotiate with Iran. You don't need to go to Vienna. You can just destroy things. You can engage in terrorism. You can kill Iranian scientists. You can blow up Iranian nuclear sites.
Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Saeed Khatibzadeh, in his weekly press briefing on Monday, April the 12th, hinted that Israel might be behind Natanz nuclear plant incident, which happened the day before the presser. He elaborated on the sabotage in Natanz nuclear facility in central Iran, saying that many sources link the sabotage operation to the Israeli regime, which had frequently threatened to run such operations against Iran. This is not going to impact Iran's nuclear capability. All centrifuges unplugged were of the old IR-1 type and will be replaced by advanced machines. Iran is not going to be trapped. The Israeli regime takes revenge on Iranian people for their patience and sage behavior. Iran would take revenge in appropriate time.
اساساً رژیم صهیونیستی مدلش اینه دیگه در مقابل ترورهایی که انجام میده خرابکاری.
It's typical of the Israeli regime to commit assassinations and acts of sabotage and refuse to assume responsibility for them. Their media, however, report that it was their doing. Our security institutions also know who the culprit has been. There must be a reciprocal action, or else our silence might send a bad signal to them.
There's no touching between Iran and America. Even with the Vienna talks, Iran refrained from indirect talks even. How it went is that the 4+1 states spoke separately to Iranian and to American representatives and brought the results to each of the two separately. The US talks tough, but is willing to hold even long-distance talks with Iran to get back into the JCPOA one way or another. Can you comment on that, please?
Last week we had Republican senators, members of the House, writing a letter to Biden that whatever agreement you will have with Iran, it's going to end once we go back to the White House. And they may go back to the White House in 2024. Who knows whether Biden is going to get reelected or he's going to be alive, or we don't know. So that's another criteria in Iranian leaders' calculation.
Foreign Minister Zarif tweeted the aim of the meeting would be to rapidly finalize sanction lifting and nuclear measures for choreographed removal of all sanctions, followed by Iran seizing remedial measures. No Iran-US meeting, unnecessary, he added. Even Western European parties to the deal couldn't or wouldn't do much to find a way around US sanctions to fulfill their trade commitments to Iran under the deal. So, Iran decided to give them time in inching out of its commitments one step at a time, whilst at the same time finding a way around sanctions itself. Fellow Easterners have cooperated in the process, and Iran is still selling oil. Iran's definite stance for return to JCPOA is that the US remove all sanctions, once and for all. How did Iran come to this distrust for the US?
You see, Donald Trump was warned against the same things when he was trying to carry out his threats. Many warned the then US administration that its maximum pressure campaign wouldn't necessarily work. Iran has been under sanctions for over 40 years and has mastered ways to circumvent them. Many countries are now unwilling to side with the US. The international system has been different at the start of the third decade of the current century compared to the first decade.
To China, Iran has been exporting oil openly up to over 1 million barrels a day reportedly. And late March, it even signed a 25-year accord with China to cover any and all economic and infrastructural aspects of cooperation, as well as military cooperation. This has been much to the dismay of the West and Israel, hence verbal and practical sabotage of the Sino-Iranian agreement. Proponents say Iran will benefit from turning east, while critics say Iran may be giving up too much in its quest to boost ties with China. Not really. Iran just has to be alert to details such as the importance of Chinese companies employing also Iranians at all levels. Given what you say and the fact that Iran has found some ways around sanctions, what means of pressure have remained for the West?
You see, the US elite is acknowledging this in their media. Just a few days ago, there was an article in the New York Times warning that the Biden administration didn't have many options available to it anymore. It said the so-called maximum pressure campaign hasn't worked and Iran has increased its nuclear capacity both qualitatively and quantitatively. The American elite is claiming, based on their interpretation of Tehran's capacities, that Iran is on the verge of building a nuclear weapon. Therefore, they argue that US needs to enter into an agreement with Iran as soon as possible.
In all, early April saw Iranian crude production rise in latest months, hitting 2.14 million barrels a day in February, and that's according to the latest S&P Global Platts survey of the OPEC output. OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. To end with a taste of the mood in Iran's governing circles, the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khamenei, said, "I've heard some Americans say today's situation is different from when JCPOA was signed in 2015-2016, and some JCPOA articles must be changed. That's true. During this time, a government took office in the US that disgraced and humiliated the US, but Iran has earned more power and reinvigorated. So, if a change is to be made, it should be to the benefit of Iran." That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Don't forget to tune in again at the same times next week and each week after, as our narrative is ongoing. Bye for now.